is The Briefing, a co-production of Now This and The Appeal. I'm joined today by Kansas City Mayor Quinton to discuss how cities can stop police violence and the epidemic of police killings of Black people. Police kill Black people every week in this country. About half of police killings involve someone living with mental illness or a disability. The latest killings in a centuries-long history of savage police brutality, Ahmaud Arbery, Breonna Taylor, George Floyd, have inspired uprisings and now city-imposed curfews across the country. This moment arrives as cities and states are slashing budgets for services across the board: waste collection, housing, education, even healthcare services, during the middle of a historically devastating pandemic. Yet police budgets remain essentially untouched, or in some cities are actually growing. And that's what we'll be talking about today. Thank you for joining us, Mr. Mayor. Mayor Lucas from Kansas City.
It's good to be with you all.
You took office in August 2019, but 4 years before becoming mayor, you were elected to the city council and took on issues such as housing, policing, and the criminal justice system. You also recently enacted a zero fare transit program instead of criminalizing people who need it but can't afford it. Not only is that a good transportation and economic issue, but it's also an important criminal justice issue. So you understand policing, police violence, and what's at stake here. The outcry over the 2019 killing of Cameron Lamb by a plainclothes Kansas City police detective, the killing of Anthony Contreras, an unarmed man who was shot in the face by Kansas City police in 2014, the continued uprisings in your city and violent behavior by Kansas City police at the uprisings, beatings, gassings, and including a viral video depicting a Kansas City police pepper spraying peaceful protesters and arresting a man who was simply raising his voice at the police. These examples and others have many local community members and advocates demanding change, calling for the resignation of the police chief, Rick Smith, because they say they do not have faith in local law enforcement. Still, amid that outcry, your budget this year includes $272 million for police, more than 15% of the city's total budget. You want to increase police spending by $10 million relative to last year. That increase is nearly a third of your city's entire $29 million budget for health. Your Department of Public Safety is more than 27% of your city budget, while your spending on overall health and medical care is about 0.03%, less than 1/3 of 1% of the city's budget. But spending on police goes beyond the budget. 2 years ago, the Kansas City Police Department spent $425,000 to settle a lawsuit over the death of Anthony Contreras. Mr. Mayor, mayors and city council members across the country are calling for measures including freezing the next cadet class and reallocating a portion of police budgets to increase mental health services. Will you commit to reallocating some of the police budget to cover public health approaches like mental health response services, housing programs, and substance use disorder treatment services like overdose prevention sites that other cities have used to save lives?
I think the way that I've usually looked to reallocate in the police budget is by tying some of their budget to those very services. So in Kansas City, we created a social worker program where we're using more social work services, taking that money out of the police budget to do it. And we usually have looked to do and build in that sort of way. There are a number of different departments, different agencies at the city, not unlike others, but I do think that it's important for us, instead of just having ongoing budget increases in the police department, actually looking at where we can enhance other services that the community really needs. People have cried out for more social worker services. Certainly they're looking for more substance abuse, mental health services. I mean, I often say that the biggest mental health facility in our city is the county jail. And that remains the case. And frankly, that's not unique to Kansas City. We need to make sure we're investing more. And so, yes, I will commit particularly to further funding for the following institution that we have in Kansas City, but we don't put enough into it. We have a mental health triage center so that a number of people who were picked up on streets, often for offenses, who were either taken to jail or to the emergency room, have some place where they can receive ongoing treatment, importantly, receive ongoing counseling, have caseworker relationships, et cetera. That's the sort of thing that's going to be key for us. You're right, rather than just increasing budgets. But I will say this about future cadet classes. We don't have enough Black and Latino cops now. I do want to make sure that as we look at the future of policing, we find a way to have more African Americans, more Latinos, more of any groups that are currently not represented on our police department in the way they should be.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. In Kansas City, the police budget was increased 4% from last year. If you transferred that amount roughly $10 million from the $272 million police budget to health and medical care. You could significantly increase funding for public health pandemic responses. You could also use that funding on education, community-based violence prevention programs that operate independently of law enforcement, or to help people experiencing homelessness or housing problems. All programs we also know are effective at reducing crime and violence. Moving forward, would you commit to reducing the police budget even by just 4% back to the level it was just last year and reallocate those dollars to other public health and social services that you clearly care very much about?
I would consider that. I don't know yet in terms of if we would recommit the money. I think the way that we would do it in Kansas City is not increase it in the same way. I mean, we've had a year-over-year increase this year due to budget realities. I assume we may not, but I'm going to make sure that I have a few things that I care about a lot. I actually don't mind making sure we're staying on salaries, officers, and others, but the problem is, and you're seeing it in protests throughout the country, there are a lot of toys, right? And departments have all types of things that I'm not sure it is necessary. I don't want to necessarily have a huge investment in tear gas each year. I don't think we actually need it, frankly. I would like to see a way that we can use more of a scalpel, but a significant one to make sure that we're not actually seeing budget increases for things that are antithetical to de-escalation and antithetical to police community relations.
With that in mind, I'd like to share some polling with you, Mr. Mayor. Polling from the Justice Collaborative Institute with Data for Progress suggests that 9 in 10 voters support creating an agency of non-law enforcement-based emergency responders that would shift most first responder responsibilities away from traditional law enforcement agencies. That's because most problems arising from substance use disorders, mental illness, and poverty require medical professionals and social workers, not criminal enforcement or armed cops. As we've covered on this program, the model works well in multiple cities across America, including Eugene, Oregon, Austin, Texas, and Denver, Colorado. In Austin, for example, the new law means that when a person calls 911, the operator provides options for police, fire, or mental health. If the person chooses mental health, a trained medic arrives instead of an armed officer. I know that you have spoken out about the need for collaboration between social workers and law enforcement, and you even recently supported budget proposals to fully fund a program that has placed social workers in police patrol divisions. But have you considered taking a step further and shifting most first responder responsibilities away from law enforcement?
I can't say I have considered that before. I will admit to not having studied that more fully, although I frankly appreciate the way it has been described that you just set up. I am familiar with programs to defund the police. I've read about that. And I think a question I've often had is, but who do we call, right, in their absence? I think this is probably the first time, and I'll admit my own ignorance, in seeing what that alternative might look like. And frankly, I think there is something to be said for, yes, if you call 911, having the mental health, fire, or police options is actually probably a good one, an efficient one that would be helpful for everyone involved, including police and fire, two very expensive departments in every American city. And so I would be happy to evaluate such a thing. For me, it would probably be in redirecting certain funding that would currently go to our other first responding departments, and then having more robust mental health providing services that are at the city.
Thanks for that, Mr. Mayor. Speaking of policing tactics, in the middle of the night on March 13th, Louisville, Kentucky police executed what's called a no-knock warrant and entered Breonna Taylor's apartment. They fired shots and hit Breonna at least 8 times, a licensed EMT who worked for 2 local hospitals. The police killed her. Police found nothing illegal in her home. In fact, the person they were searching for was already in custody. The tactics they used, a battering ram, the element of surprise, some of the equipment that you just spoke about, are used by police departments all over the country with disastrous results. The Louisville City Council president is calling for 3 measures in response to the killing of Ms. Taylor. And I want to know if you'd be willing to call for similar measures in Kansas City. Let's start with the first 2 because they go together. The banning of no-knock warrants altogether, and then only allowing quick knock warrants when police are investigating a crime involving a serious physical harm like murder or rape, and there is evidence to suggest someone inside is in danger. Do you support ending no-knock warrants and limiting military-style raids in this way in your city?
On the ban of no-knock warrants, I recall studying those in law school. And we have seen enhanced restrictions coming from the criminal law of the Supreme Court, frankly, in connection with that. A broad-based ban on no-knock warrants, I would need to study more before I make a clear declaration there. I will move though to quick, kind of those types of warrants. And usually we've seen problems with those with the use of flashbang devices, the police throwing things in, right? And then running into any number of issues. I think in Kansas City, we had legal action relating to a child who was injured in a situation like that. That is not unusual in the United States. I would like to see an elimination of those types of tools being used. I don't think they're essential. I think, it takes patience, but right, suspects do often leave homes. There are other ways to serve. And frankly, when we don't know who's in there, we have an issue. I'll give one example. My sister had a relationship with a gentleman who was wanted by the police, but it had broken off some years before. Nevertheless, they came in with guns drawn. At the time, my then 2-year-old nephew and, pardon me, 2-year-old niece and 6-year-old nephew were there with them going through, right? It would be something if that were just a one-off story, but that's a story that's happened a lot in Kansas City, a lot in every American city, and it's something that is used too often. So I would really like to see a limitation or elimination of that practice.
In Louisville, the police chief or a designee from the chief needs to sign off on military-style raids, like we just discussed. And all such raids must be reported to the city council every 3 months. Would you support those kind of accountability and transparency measures, at least in Kansas City?
Yeah, I mean, I think that so yes is the answer. A little more context is, and I was talking to police officers the other day. I actually don't think that this moment is about your rank and file police officer. If we look at them too much, then we're making a mistake. Changing the system fundamentally requires us to change what politicians are allowing and what command staff are directing, right? My Kansas City police officers who were on the front lines the other day at that protest here did not make the election to deploy tear gas. They don't make the election to order up on pepper spray at the beginning of the year or to have beanbag rounds or rubber bullets, right? Those are command staff determinations. And ultimately, those are determinations that are made by mayors and leadership throughout cities. And so I absolutely think that we need to see more policies that severely limit who can sign off on a military style raid, such that there is accountability and such that if it goes awry, we're not blaming 2 cops who've been on the force for 5 or 10 years, but instead there's actually someone who can take a fall. Because if someone has to take the fall, then I think they'll be far more judicious and actually allowing for certain types of tools to be used.
Mr. Mayor, I have just one last question for you. There's a lot of anger and frustration out there right now, as you well know. This moment cannot be more urgent and more pressing in our country and every city across this country. In my view, we're in the middle of a crisis within a crisis, a long history of police violence that's taken countless Black lives, on top of a pandemic that's devastating our country, and again, disproportionately devastating the lives of Black people. I mean, here we are, Mr. Mayor, you and I. We're sitting here talking about another dead Black person, dead because of the actions of a cop, a killing that was once again caught on camera. It's a moment in my mind to radically rethink what we mean when we say public safety, what we mean when we want to achieve it. I hear the urgency, I hear the understanding in your voice, in your rhetoric, but I want to hear where you think you're being urgent right now in this moment, enacting policy that changes things in your city once and for all. This feels like a crisis that needs to end immediately. What are you doing right now in solidarity with, say, the Black Lives Matter movement? What are you doing right now to make people's lives safer in Kansas City from this exact police violence?
So, a few different steps that I think are important. One, and I'll describe in one of the world's most backwards things, Kansas City has a board of police commissioners that is appointed by the governor, and I'm just one of 5 members. That presents some challenges on our ability to act, but we haven't let that be dispositive. I called an emergency meeting of the Board of Police Commissioners yesterday, the first one that I have ever been a part of with this board, and I think one of the few that they've done. We did a few things. One, we created a requirement that all officer-involved shootings be reviewed by an outside agency, not just having the department do that review themselves. We also require that all serious use of force violations be reported to an outside agency. All. Not just what we may think is important, not just anything of that sort, but sending both of those out at least allows people to know that there is some greater accountability in terms of what we're doing. Recognizing that officers may know of other officer misconduct, we're enhancing whistleblower provisions to permit officers to report, to have an outside approach to reporting that doesn't just go to internal affairs and thus jeopardizing their own careers. We think that is vital. We also are requiring further reporting of the Kansas City Police Department to the Kansas City City Council more regularly. Not just in my city, but in lots of them, nobody knows what's going on. Nobody actually knows the tools that are there, right? If I asked half my colleagues on the city council, how much pepper spray did we buy this year? Nobody would know. And these are the sorts of things that are public record that should be in the sunlight. And often you just need to create a form in which those could be asked. Another thing that I have a power to do as mayor, at least in Kansas City, I don't know how many other cities, but is the power of pardon. And I pardoned someone yesterday in connection with a violation that someone received for videotaping alleged police misconduct. In the video, the police had a rough arrest on a person. They subsequently were charged for assault. Nevertheless, the videotaper was also given a citation. And so we did pardon that yesterday rather, and I'll continue to look to other areas, particularly in connection with nonviolent actions, where we can find the opportunity for pardons, which I think will lead for better criminal justice in Kansas City.
That seems fair-minded to me, Mayor. Would you consider pardoning, just blanket pardoning protesters involved in the streets of Kansas City right now? Clearly, people are outraged and frustrated and need to vent this anger and also are seeking actual change. Would you be willing to let those people go free?
And yes is the answer. I think we kind of started the ball rolling yesterday. We're doing research on the charges, but I think if it is, failure to follow a lawful order, which usually just means, they bullhorned something your way and for whatever reason they caught up with you and you didn't run as fast as others, then I think that might be a situation in which we should really have blanket pardons. I think there are charges with violence and it'll be easy to separate the two.
Thank you so much, Mr. Mayor. We are at the end of our time. Really appreciate your thoughts today. Thank you so much for joining us. We'll be live again Monday, June 8th, to talk further about police violence and this crisis that faces our country.